Hi, my name is Danielle Cohen. I'm with the Cherry Hill High School West AFJROTC. The veteran I will be interviewing today is Lieutenant Colonel John Murphy. His birthday is December 2nd, 1940. He served in the Army in Vietnam. We are conducting this interview at the American Legion Post 372 Hall in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Sue Quinn-Morris of the Ladies Auxiliary is video recording the interview. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy, please have a seat.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with, did you draft, or were you drafted, or did you enlist?
No, I enlisted about a month and a half after my 17th birthday. I got my parents to sign for me. Initially, I wanted to join the Navy. I wanted to go into submarines. And the Navy recruiter, a very kind person, took me down to the Navy Yard and took me on a tour of an old Second World War boat that was a dockside trainer. The name of the boat was the USNS Permit. And about a half an hour stumbling through the boat, barking my shins, banging my head, and then trying one of the bunks that were only about 6 feet 4 inches long, and I'm 6'6", convinced me he was right. I was too tall for the Navy. So I joined the Army instead.
Is that the only reason you joined the Army?
I wanted to go into the military. And I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I thought that, 3 years in the military would at least give me time to mature and figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life.
Do you remember your first day?
Yeah. We showed up at Schuylkill Arsenal down on next to Schuylkill River on I forgot the name of the street, but it was about 4 o'clock in the morning. And they loaded us onto buses and drove us up to 30th Street Station and put us on a troop train headed for Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Back then they had some theory that instead of taking basic training near where you lived, which would have been Fort Dix for me, they want to send you to the other side of the country so you can't go AWOL. That was the theory back then. And it was a 2-day train ride down to Columbia, South Carolina. And boring.
Were you nervous at all?
No, for some reason I wasn't. When I got down there though and met the DIs, I started getting nervous then.
Can you talk a little bit about your first couple of weeks of boot camp training?
Well, basic training was it was rough. Back then, Fort Jackson was not known as a friendly place. Now they call it Relaxing Jackson, but that's 40 years after the fact. We got down there and we got assigned to an area of tents just south of what they call Tank Hill. And it was January and it was cold, bitter cold. And we lived in these 8-man tents. There were 2 coal stoves, one on each end of the tent. And you could be standing right next to the stove. It would be glowing cherry red. Your front would be on fire and your backside would be freezing. When you got into your bunk at night, you covered yourself, you got into your sleeping bag, you covered yourself with your blankets that they issued you and your overcoat that they had issued us. And you still weren't warm enough. It was terrible. It was cold. The latrines were about probably 50 yards from the tents. So you'd go down there to take a shower, and half the time, if you were slow in the uptake, by the time you got down there, the water would be ice cold. You had to clean yourself up anyway. We had a kid in our tent who decided he didn't want to bathe, and we ended up giving him a GI shower. We used a scrub brush on him, and he was cherry red when we get done with him, but he bathed after that. You know, the guy it was obnoxious to be in the same tent with him. He smelled that bad. But I can understand why he didn't want to bathe. We did our qualification out at the Leesburg Ranges, and I pulled pit duty, and that means you pull the targets down. You're standing in a pit, and the bullets are going just over your head, and you pull the target down, you look for the holes, and you mark it with a little disc, and run it back up again, and if they missed it entirely, you'd pick up a red flag, which we used to call Maggie's drawers, and you'd wave it back and forth. Back then, all qualification was done on the KD course, known distance course. Now they use pop-up silhouettes, and you don't know what distance it's going to come up at. It could be 300 yards, it could be 100 yards, it could be 50 yards, you don't know. But back then, you did everything at 100, at I think 300, and then 500 yards. And I qualified expert. I was a good shot. When I was a kid, I had a .22 rifle that I used to shoot with the junior NRA. So that really taught me how to shoot. And by the time the Army got me, I was dead eye.
Which wars did you serve in, and where did you go during that?
Well, I initially went from basic to the Army Security Agency up to Fort Devens, went through training up there as a traffic analyst. And then I was sent to the 320th ASA Battalion in Bad Aibling, Germany. And we ended up going down to Lebanon during the first Lebanon crisis, Detachment L1. And we spent about 2 months down in Beirut. And we were involved with communications intelligence. And basically it's eavesdropping on the bad guys. And then I went back to Germany and finished out my tour in Germany. Came back to the States, and I got out of the regular Army and joined the National Guard. The old 166 Field Artillery that used to be down on Broad Street years ago. And while I was with the National Guard, I was going to college at Temple. And then they sent me through 2nd Army NCO Academy, and that was preparatory to sending me out to Harrisburg and Indiantown Gap for the Pennsylvania Army National Guard's Officer Candidate Program. And I went out there, and Vietnam started to heat up. I was 2 weeks from graduation, and I decided to go back in the regular Army. So I re-enlisted. Of course, you know, I went from being an E6 down to an E2, because I went from National Guard to back to regular Army. And my idea was I was going to take my chances at going to officer candidate school with the regular Army. And I went through basic again, again at Fort Jackson, but this time I was in barracks, thankfully. And it was a modified. I only spent 6 weeks there because once I finished qualifying with the new weapons, I didn't have to do anything else. And then they sent me down to advanced infantry training at Augusta, Georgia, at Fort Gordon. And that's because I had volunteered for airborne. And I'd also taken the Special Forces battery test to get into Special Forces. And while I was there, I decided to put in for OCS. And my first choice was infantry. My second choice was intelligence and security, because that's what I'd done when I was enlisted. And because I scored high on the math portion of the OCS test, they sent me to Fort Sill, Robinson Barracks. So I graduated from Robinson Barracks in class 15-66, about 8 classes ahead of Barney Franks. And from there I went to Fort Benning for jump school. And then from there I went to Fort Bragg. I went through the Special Forces Officers Course. And then I was assigned to the 3rd Special Forces Group. And after about 2 years, it looked like I was going to do another year at Bragg and then maybe get out of the Army. And I figured, you know, I was trained for combat, so I called, I forgot her name, but she was a lady in Washington at personnel, and I asked to be put on a levy for Vietnam. I volunteered for it. And I got orders that were going to send me to the 5th Special Forces Group in Vietnam. And when I got into Benoit, at just outside of Saigon, it's the Air Force base there, some young NCO came up to me and said, "Sorry, Dai Huy," it's Vietnamese for captain, but we're going to have to divert you up to the Americal Division. There's a critical shortage of company grade officers. And I'm thinking, oh, I wonder why, you know? So I end up going up to the Americal Division. I check in with the G1 up there. He sits there and he says, "We're going to give you an artillery battery." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, can you give me something else? Because the last time I looked at an artillery tube was in Officer Candidate School. For the last three years I've been Special Forces." They said, "Okay, we'll give you a rifle company." That's something like, you know, SF something like infantry. I said, "Fine." So they sent me to the 4th Battalion of the 3rd Infantry, and I ended up commanding Alpha Company. And I was there from June of 68 to June of 69, and I managed to make it through. Let me back up a little bit. My first day in the field, I was terrified. I was terrified that I'd screw up and I'd get somebody killed, you know, from a stupid mistake. And somehow or other, I lucked out and I managed to make it through my whole time as company commander without getting anybody killed. And after that, I came back to the States and expiration of my service agreement, and I went back into the National Guard and ended up as headquarters commandant of 2nd Battalion of the 111th Infantry. And I stayed there for about a year, and I didn't like it. They didn't really train, they partied. So I transferred to the 11th Special Forces Group, over in Pedricktown, New Jersey, and I was with them for a couple of years. Then I went to a civil affairs unit, 304 Civil Affairs up in Woodhaven Road, and then I was offered battalion command of an artillery battalion, and I grabbed that, and had that for 3 years. And of course, the whole time I'm doing all this, I was with the United States Customs Service, with the Customs Agency Service. When I finished up my time with battalion command, I branch transferred into Special Forces because I figured field artillery had nothing left for me. I was a lieutenant colonel at the time, and the only way to get promoted higher than that was to get a brigade command, artillery brigade, and there aren't any artillery brigades in reserves. So I went IRR and managed to get a lot of active duty time in. He sent me to Korea for 2 years. I was Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for 8th Army, United Nations Command, and Combined Forces Army. I wore 3 hats. And my rating officer was a Medal of Honor winner by the name of Bob Howard, Colonel Bob Howard. And my senior rater was Major General Bill Carpenter, William S. Carpenter, and back during the Vietnam War, we used to call him Napalm Bill. He was a West Pointer and a graduate of Springfield High School in Delaware County. And then just before, about a month before the Panama invasion, I was assigned to Special Operations Command South in Panama as the deputy team chief for SOC South. And went down on the invasion and retired out of there in '93 as theater team chief instead of deputy theater team chief after my boss had retired, and I ended up moving into his spot. And that was probably the best duty I ever had in the military. It was Panama. It was wonderful. Loved it down there.
Did you ever experience any major casualties?
I'm sorry?
Did you ever experience any major casualties, like within your unit?
No, not really. You know, we had a couple of guys that got wounded. I had one kid one time that got hit in the leg with a carbine bullet, 30 caliber carbine that the VC had. And then he also got hit in the backside with a tracer that had hit a rock first and then flattened out and shaved a spot of skin off his backside about the size of a silver dollar. And the kid was fine. I mean, he wasn't hurt that bad. And I'm working on him, and this medic comes running up and says, "Holy mackerel, look at that size of the hole in his ass." And with that, the kid immediately went into shock. So we had to put a blood expander in him, and I got rid of the medic. But we had to get him medevaced. And Marines flew in to take him out. We were out in the Hepduck Valley in Vietnam. And they flew him all the way up to Da Nang. And the kid was fine after that. I had one kid that was Quick Draw McGraw. He was one of my grenadiers with the M79 grenade launcher. And he had the trigger on this particular weapon folds to the side either way for cold weather use when you're using mittens, so you just have the trigger there. And he figured, that's cool, you know, I'm going to use it for quick draw. Well, he had this thing loaded with a sabot round with buckshot in it, and slung barrel down over his shoulder, and we were going through the woods, and he caught it on a vine, the trigger. It went off, and it hit him in the leg, and his leg looked like somebody had taken an ice cream scoop and just scooped it right out of his leg. So he was casualty. Didn't lose his leg, but he was hurt. And I had another kid that didn't follow instructions and opened the law with his hand behind it, and it went off and took his hand off. We had 3 or 4 people, including myself, wounded in firefights. But for the most part, most of the people that we had wounded were wounded by just stupid mistakes and self-inflicted wounds, or, you know, friendly fire. Well, friendly fire, it's not friendly, but somebody else getting careless and shooting somebody else. That's, I would say probably 60%, 70% of the people that were wounded in my company were wounded by stupidity.
How and where were you injured?
I got hit in the legs, fragments from an RPG, and just peppered my legs.
What was your most memorable experience?
My most memorable experience was in July of 1966. My son was a second-year cadet at West Point, and he was going through jump school, and I got permissive hazardous duty orders from Colonel Nick Vay at 1st Army to go down and jump with him on his graduation jump. So I went out the door with my son and pinned my old blood wings on him on the drop zone. Broke both my heels during the jump, compression fractures, but it was worth it.
What medals were you awarded, and how did you get them?
Well, I've got Soldier's Medal, I've got a Bronze Star for Valor, of course I got the Purple Heart. I've got several Army Commendation Medals, and also a whole bunch of Army Achievement Medals. And, you know, the I Was There medals, like the Vietnam Campaign. I've got the Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal and the United Nations Medal for Lebanon. Humanitarian Service Awards, stuff like that. The Reserve Overseas Service Medal. But they're not personal awards, they're just, I was there. I'm also a master parachutist. I'm Halo qualified, and I've got the Combat Infantryman's Badge from the time I served as a rifle company commander.
While you were in the service, how did you stay in touch with your family?
I'm sorry?
How did you stay in touch with your family while you were?
Well, I tried to write as much as I could, but you know, at times my family was with me, but when I was in Vietnam, of course they weren't. And I'd write maybe once a week. Sometimes I'd just write something, dash it off on a piece of a C ration box, and just write, you know, free in the corner, because we had free mail. And when I got back, of course, you know, the wife says, well, why didn't you write every day? And I couldn't explain to her that I was a company commander of a rifle company, and I had too much to do. I had to keep my guys alive. I had a lot of stuff to do. I had no time, really, for personal business. And writing letters is personal business. You know, if I wasn't in a firefight or you know, walking 50 clicks, I was sleeping when I could.
What type of food did you eat, and was it rationed like really strictly, or?
Well, in the States, of course, we had decent food. Of course, once I became an officer, I had to pay for my own meals. When I was in Vietnam, I got 2 C rations a day, and the Army was kind enough to charge me for 3. Took it out of my pay. Occasionally I'd get LARP rations, which were really good. I liked those. C rations were okay. Then by the time Panama rolled around, they had the MREs, and that's meal ready to eat. Of course, our word for it was meals refused by Ethiopians. I didn't like them. It's all in plastic pouches, and once you open it, you got to eat it. You can't put it down. With the old C rations, you know, you could heat up a can of beans or whatever, and then if you needed to set it down, you could set it down. It wouldn't fall over or anything like that. You could use the empty cans to make a coffee cup. You could also use one of the empty cans to make a makeshift cook stove. And then we'd use little rolled up pieces of C4 explosive, and with a piece about half the size of a dime in the bottom of this can, you could heat up 8 ounces of water to boiling to make a cup of coffee. It was great. Just didn't want to try to stomp it out after you made your cup, because then it would go off. But the new MREs I just didn't like, because if you have to put it down, it falls over and everything runs out. It's all over the place, and you just lost your dinner. And I didn't like the taste of them, I guess. I don't know.
Was there ever a time where you guys were really low on supplies, or there was something you did that you didn't have?
Yeah, I had an occasion. My company had just gone through the North Vietnamese base camp after it had been bombarded in an arc-light strike. It's B-52 bomb strike. And we went in there to, after the bomb strike, to see, you know, damage assessment and all that, see how many bodies we could find, see what was there and all that. And a deputy division commander from the Americal Division, General Cooksey, came out, and he asked me if there's anything he could do for me, and I said, well, like what? He says, you want an R&R? You know, would you want to go up to division staff? I said, no, sir. I said, what I need is about 100 pairs of socks. He says, what? I said, our socks are rotting off our feet. They're funky. And he says, you can't get them in the supply system? I said, sir, I've been trying. I can't. He says, I'll get you socks. And he did. And then he got mad at me because I was wearing cross cannons. And he said, are you the FO? I said, no, I'm the company commander. He said, well, what are you doing wearing cross cannons? I said, because my basic branch is field artillery. He says, not any longer, it's not. You're infantry. So he leaves. About 2 hours later, his helicopter comes back, and his aide-de-camp gets off the helicopter and comes running down and hands me a set of cross rifles. And I said, Captain, did General Cooksey send you out here to give me a 15-cent pair of cross rifles? He says, yep. So will you go get back on your chopper and you go back where it's safe? And I took all my insignia off and I threw it in the bush. And after that, I never wore any rank insignia in the field.
Was there ever anything you did for good luck, or just keep yourself safe?
No, not really. You know, luck is what you make it.
When you weren't doing military stuff, how did you guys entertain yourselves?
In combat or?
Both.
Well, in combat, we'd get a stand down, maybe every 2 months, we'd get a 3-day stand down. And they'd have floor shows at the club for the enlisted men. And I'd buy them a pallet of beer and a case of scotch. I'd put it out on the company street. And I'd say, okay, guys, have at it. But when we go back out in the field, everybody better be sober. And for 2 days, they'd pretty well get drunk. And then the next day, they'd clean their weapons, rearm and all that, and get over their hangovers.
Did you do anything special when you were on leave?
When I was on leave, I'd go home if I could. There were occasions, you know, when I was enlisted in Germany, when I went on leave and I toured Europe. I've been all over the place. It was kind of neat. Got into Holland, got into Austria, got into France. I didn't like French. The French didn't that much. I didn't like Paris, but and where I was stationed in Germany was in Bavaria, and the people down there were wonderful. You know, we had a good time with them.
What was your favorite place that you got to visit?
Probably my favorite place was Panama City. After Noriega was, you know, arrested.
Were there any particularly funny or unusual events that popped in your mind?
Well, when I was in Vietnam, I told you about the medic that had put my young trooper in a shock. What I did is I sent him back to the rear. And actually, he sent himself back. He claimed he had heat stroke. And we got a medevac chopper in for him, which took him back to the rear. The next day, I got a call from the battalion commander, Colonel Albert L. Russell, or Lieutenant Colonel Albert L. Russell. He was an armor officer. But he commanded the 4th Battalion of the 3rd Infantry out of the 11th Brigade. And he said, well, I want to send line number 12 back out to you. And we didn't use people's names. It was my number. And I said, well, I won't be responsible for him. He said, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, if one of my men doesn't kill him, then I will. So he says, okay, we'll keep him here. And they made him, pardon my French, they made him a shit burner. In Vietnam, every Thursday was shit burning day. All of our latrines were 55-gallon drums that were cut off halfway and slid into the back of an outhouse. You weren't allowed to dig outhouses into the ground. You weren't allowed to, you know, pollute the ground. And every Thursday they'd come along and they'd pull these things out and fill them with diesel fuel and set fire to it and burn it. So they told this kid to burn out the officer's latrine because it was really funky. And he made one small mistake. He didn't bother to take the can out from the back. So he burnt down the officer's latrine. So they got real mad at him and said, okay, you burn it down, you're going to build a new one. They got in the materials and stuff, and he did, I got to say this for the kid, he did a nice job. He built a 2-hole, had it wired for electricity, had magazine racks on either side, had the door screened, and had the thing over the cans in the back. That was screened, so you know you didn't have flies in there. And he actually went out to the harbor in Chu Lai where there was a derelict old LST, and he got 2 toilet seats, regular toilet seats from the ship, you know, the parts of it that are above water, and brought those back and put them in there. And you know, that way we're not sitting on raw lumber. And I was in on a stand down, and I got the story later that the Battalion S3 had told this kid to put something in the cans. They weren't ready to be burnt yet, but they stank real bad. Well, the kid put something in the cans that killed the smell. Gasoline. And I get in on stand down, and I'm sitting on the back step of the officer's hooch, shining shoes and writing letters, and 20 feet away is the officer's latrine. And I see Major Mad Dog, our Battalion S3, Mad Dog Mackinac. And he's heading down toward the latrine, got a magazine in his hand, ever-present cigar in his mouth, but it's not lighted. Now he goes in and he sits down, and he's reading his magazine, and he takes one of these kitchen matches and strikes it, lights a cigar. He's reading his magazine, and he throws it into the hole next to him. And of course, with that, you got woof, and just like somebody trying to start a immersion heater. With you get that flashback, and he came flying right out through the screen door. His backside was on fire, and I started laughing. I couldn't help it, and I ran in and got a blanket off one of the bunks, went up and put him out. And I mean, his dignity was hurt more than he was, but every year that we had a reunion after that at Fort Myer, we remind him of it. And we never let him live that one down. But what they did was with the door gunner, with the medic, is they shipped him over to a helicopter unit. And I heard that he screwed up as a door gunner, and they shipped him back to the States and gave him Section 8.
Did you ever pull any pranks?
Huh?
Did you ever pull any pranks?
Oh yeah. When I was in Bed Aibling, we used to send the new guys down to battalion headquarters at 5 o'clock for the cannon report. Of course, they'd walk all the way down to battalion headquarters, and at 5 o'clock, it's retreat. They'd fire the cannon, and then play retreat service, lower the flag, and of course by then, they'd catch on the cannon report. We used to send people for, 100 yards of firing line, things like that, You did that to the newbies. In fact, they tried to pull it on me, and I caught on, and I just went to the service club.
Do you have any pictures left from?
Yeah, I've got a whole bunch of slides from Vietnam, and I've got a bunch of pictures from Panama.
What was your first impression of all the soldiers and officers?
When I first got the company, I was scared because about 90% of them were draftees. And I had just come from the Special Forces unit where everybody was a volunteer in regular Army. And I was really worried because they were draftees and they were people that didn't want to be in the military and whatever. And it turned out they were probably the finest bunch of soldiers I ever served with in my life.
Did you ever keep a diary or a journal? A diary or a journal?
No. Army regulations says you're not allowed to keep a diary in combat, and I just never kept one.
Do you remember your last day of service with your diary?
What?
Do you remember your last day when your diary?
Yeah. My last day, I capped it off with a jump with Naval Special Warfare Unit 8 in Rodman Barracks in Panama. We jumped into Gatun Lake. That was my last jump and my last day before I hit the States.
Did you go to work afterwards?
When I came back, I went to work for a steamship agency, Northern Lily International, and I ended up becoming port manager in Philadelphia and Wilmington, and I retired last September.
Have you kept any friends?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, last night I called, talked to two guys that I served with 40 years ago in Germany. A guy by the name of Arthur L. Frisbee and Hubert L. Smozinski. And talked to both of them last night, and it was fun.
Are you part of any veterans organizations?
I belong to the Special Forces Association. I'm D 6068 life member. I'm a member of the Purple Heart Association. I'm a member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and I'm a member of this American Legion post. And I'm also a member of the American Legion Riders and the Patriot Guard Riders, the motorcycles.
Has your experience in the past influenced your feelings about the war now?
Well, yes and no. My son's been involved in it. He just got back from his 7th tour in Iraq. He was there in the first Gulf War with A Company, 2nd of the 505th, out of the 82nd Airborne Division. And he came back from that, and he didn't want to talk about it. And I tried to get him to talk, he didn't want to talk. And apparently he was a little bit of PTSD working there. And the way he handled it is he became a chaplain. He became a Pentecostal minister. I went back in the Army as a chaplain. He did 3 years as chaplain for the 1st Ranger Battalion out of Fort Stewart, well, Hunter Army Air Base. Then he went to Hohenfels for 3 years as the base chaplain in Germany at Hohenfels. Came back to the States and did 3 years as 2nd Brigade chaplain for the 82nd Airborne Division. And he's just now finishing up his 3 years as 5th Special Forces Group chaplain. And his next assignment, which I think starts in June, he goes to Fort Bragg, and he will be Deputy Command Chaplain for United States Army Special Forces Command.
So that's it for what I have to ask. Is there anything you would like to add?
Well, from what I've seen over the years, our military is probably the best military we've ever had. When I was stationed at Bragg in the 60s, the 82nd Airborne Division was not all that good. We used to call it almost airborne. And what they've got today, they're probably the finest soldiers we've got outside of, Special Forces. I'm a little biased there. But this all-volunteer Army works. We've got young men and women who are serving because they want to serve. Not because they have to, not because they've been drafted. They choose to. And when you have people that want to serve, you can pick and choose and get the best. And apparently we've done that. We've done a real good job with it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.